is welcome to, it's my first live Sentry event actually. So this is quite an exciting occasion. I am the newest member of the DevRel team at Sentry, and I'm here to host Sebastian, the creator of FastAPI. So we had at Sentry our first ever FastAPI meetup in Berlin not so long ago. And this is a follow-up event to answer all the questions that you had for Sebastian that you couldn't get to on the day. So first of all, Sebastian, tell us about the meetup. What happened? How was it? How many people were there? Was it good?
Thank you very much. I had a lot of fun at the event. It was super fun. There were a lot of people from all around the world, actually. So yeah, it was amazing. We had great speakers as well. Sentry brought Armin Ronacher. I don't know how to pronounce that. Armin Ronacher, the creator of Flask. We had Samuel Colvin, the creator of Pydantic. We had Marcelo Trilesinski, or Cludex, the current maintainer of Starlet and Ubicorn, and he's also like one of the top FastAPI expert currently, and like he's been helping a lot all the ecosystem. We also had David Kramer was hosting us and like spicing things up. So it was quite fun. We also had like people just visiting and just like as guests, like Lucas Langa, the creator of Black and the current Python developer in residence. And we had Hinek, the creator of Athers, was also there hanging out. It was super fun. A lot of great people. And yeah, I had a lot of fun. I hope a lot of people had a lot of fun as well.
Excellent. And how was the food at the meetup? There's always good food usually.
Yeah, I think it was good. The thing is that I was always talking to people, and I always arrived at the tables when there was like almost nothing left. But yeah, like for me, that was the main point for me, was just like chatting with people. So that was amazing.
Amazing. It's like when you get married, isn't it? And like the bride and groom, or the bride and the bride, the people who get married, they don't get to get the food. They just have to speak to everyone and walk around, and you know, it's the same thing. I don't know why I'm talking about this. Anyway, let's get to the questions. So we've got a few different categories and sets of questions that I've tried to curate into a sensible system. We did get so many questions, a lot of them about Pydantic, a lot of them about FastAPI in general, and some about being general web developers and how you can kind of level up and improve your skills. So I'm going to start with that. So someone asked in with the question, I've been a Python dev for almost 10 years, and it feels like I'm stuck at the intermediate level for quite a few years. So how can I advance to the next level from here?
I think this is a fun and interesting question, because I think many of us keep asking that all the time. And I've come to the conclusion that it's not worth trying to, get to the next level and like having that idea of like, oh, when am I going to get to the next level? Because it's a moving target. You always have lots more to learn. The more you learn, the more you see how much you still have to learn. And I think it's a much better approach to focus on a problem that is important to you, and a problem that is interesting, and that hopefully something that is important to you, even better if it affects you directly, and just trying to solve that and doing whatever you need to solve that. Normally, it will be just learning how to use a tool to solve that particular problem. But in some cases, you end up just like building something new because it just didn't exist. And you end up, I don't know, building a company, a product, or like an open source project, or contributing to one that already exists. But it's much better to have your focus on a problem, on a specific problem that you want to solve. That's much better, like to grow as a developer, or also if you want to build products, or you want to build open source, or you want to innovate, whatever, like all of those things, I think are kind of side effects of solving a problem. And what is important the most is to focus on solving a problem, and like using that as a guide for you to follow.
I think the internet in general is a lot to blame there, really, isn't it? Because you get a lot of people talking on the internet about how to be a 10x developer, how to level up your skills, how to do this, how to make millions of dollars. And, I've always talked about how development isn't really about that. Like, it's exactly what you say. It's about solving problems. And through the act of solving those problems, you'll automatically level up. And I mean, I would say to this question, if you are thinking about, if you think you're only at an intermediate level, you're probably higher than you are anyway in the grand scheme of things, because the more you know about development, the less you know anyway, and the more you know you need to know. So you're doing great. So in general software development practices, so Sebastian, would you agree that software developers should first make software that is useful? And if you need to make it pretty, then do that. And then only if you need to, make it fast. So it's the whole useful, pretty, fast. Do you subscribe to that?
Yeah, I agree. I remember what also Lucas Lange was saying that really some time ago, speaking of Flask or of Black or something like that, and was like, make it work, make it right, and then make it fast. If you try to optimize, like if you try to make it fast from the beginning, like you end up doing a lot of premature optimization and optimizing things that just don't matter that much. So it's so much better first to make sure that it actually works and that it helps anything, someone that is useful, and then making sure that it's actually correct. And then you can actually make it, do like anything needed to make it faster. But the first step to make it fast is to profile the application, to make sure what are the specific pieces of code that need to be run the most and that are being slow, because you might end up optimizing a huge section of code, a huge bunch of code that is super complex, and you just spend months in that, and then afterwards you realize that it's just like used by one user once a year, and that's what you spent the time optimizing. So it's not really worth it, putting all that effort into something that still hasn't proven the value of working on that. So yeah, definitely I agree with that.
A phrase I often use, I've been using for a long time, is build first, engineer later, which, you know, encompasses all of that. Just get it out there, just build it, copy and paste your code if you need to, rather than abstracting it out, and then see what happens. Brilliant advice. Okay, thank you. Now we're going to go into some very specific questions about Pydantic and FastAPI. The first one is, for how long will FastAPI still support Pydantic V1?
I don't have a predefined timeline. And I don't have like any particular hurry. The ones that will have the biggest hurry are the users, because Pydantic V2 is just so much faster, so much better, and much more correct. And I think a lot of people are already migrating to Pydantic V2. I also am working on SQL model and a bunch of things. One of the next things that I have to work on is support for SQL Alchemy version 2 and Pydantic version 2. So that definitely has to happen before I even deprecate Pydantic version 1. I'm gonna, just like keep checking how many people are still using Pydantic V1 before like removing everything. But I think like I don't have any particular hurry. I think it will be good to migrate, but it's not like it's not gonna happen tomorrow or something like that. It's definitely something to put in the backlog and not at the end. But in particular, because you're going to have so much better performance and so much more correctness, and like new features are going to support mainly Pydantic V2. And if you don't want to be like stuck in the past, you probably will want to do that. But it's not that you have to worry that like, oh, I'm going to remove that tomorrow or something like that.
Okay, thank you. So talking of Pydantic, besides Pydantic, what other tools can be used?
So with FastAPI, the good thing is that it's very much pure Python, and it's just using like the standard Python and using standard Python type annotations, using async and await. It doesn't do anything strange. So what will need you to use a bunch of plugins or extensions in other frameworks to integrate with the framework. In FastAPI, normally you don't really need a plugin or an extension. You just need whatever is the package that does the thing that you want to do, and then you just connect it directly. If you need some additional features and you need it to run before the request or something like that, then you just use dependencies, which is like a feature in FastAPI for those that don't know. But the thing is that you don't really need to install another package that is like, authentication for FastAPI or something like that. So if you want to connect with Redis, you just install the Redis package. If you want to connect with a SQL database, then you just install the SQL database package, and you just connect all that through dependencies. So you can use anything. Now, about specific suggestions that I will make. With FastAPI, well, of course, you will use Pydantic for handling like, all the data. For handling settings for the data, you will use Pydantic settings that can read settings from environment variables or .env files, and that also can be extended to, like Kubernetes secrets or whatnot. And because it's just based on Pydantic, you just define a model the same way that you will define a Pydantic model. So you can handle all the settings for your application that way, and it just like works great. If you want to communicate with other APIs, you will use HTTPX because it supports async and await, and it also supports non-async and await code. So you can have you can pretty much replace requests with HTTPX, and then whenever you need to use async and await, then you can still keep using HTTPX. If you want to communicate with SQL databases, you will probably use SQL Model, which is the library that I built on top of SQL Alchemy and Pydantic to simplify everything and to make it very easy to integrate with FastAPI. So you will probably use that for connecting and communicating with SQL databases. If you want to connect with MongoDB databases, you will probably use Mantic or Beanie. There are two packages that are based on Pydantic. I personally normally use Mantic because it also supports async and await and non-async and await code. One of the key things of FastAPI is that you normally can use standard blocking code, like regular blocking code without async and await, and just keep using all the code wherever you need. And whenever you need to squeeze performance or you need to do stuff concurrently, then you can use async and await. But otherwise, you don't have to from the get-go, at least. So you can keep compatibility with all the code that you already have. And these libraries also have this compatibility between each other. So I think that those will be some suggestions for libraries to use. For tools to use, I will use Rough for formatting and linting and sorting imports and removing that code and a bunch of things. MyPy for checking the code, that the code is correct, that the types are correct. And well, there's a lot of other tools, but I think I will leave it at those.
Thank you. So you briefly touched on performance, squeezing performance, and we have a question on the list and a question in the chat already about what should I consider when I'm creating an app using FastAPI that could have thousands of users. What are the things you need to be mindful of, and how can you make the app as performant as possible?
So it's kind of twofold. The first thing is, if you're building a new product, you're building a new tool, you probably don't need to worry too much about that yet. If you try to squeeze all the performance from the beginning, you're going to end up spending a lot of time in something that doesn't really, is not that important yet. Because with a simple FastAPI application, you will normally, for example, start building the application not using async and await, just using blocking code, because it's just going to be faster to write that code. It's not going to have more performance. It's going to have less performance than if you used async and await and all the libraries compatible and everything perfectly fine-tuned. So it's going to have less performance, but you're going to be much faster building your product. And if you use tools that are compatible with async and await, then later you can actually switch whatever is the regions of the code that you actually need to do that. The next thing is you have thousands of users, but having thousands of users doesn't necessarily mean that they are connecting during the same second to your API. In many cases, during the same second, you have I don't know, hundreds of users, not necessarily thousands, at least if you're just starting. And with that, you can just deploy your FastAPI application almost however you want, and it's just gonna work pretty much well. Whenever you are reaching the point where you have thousands of users per second and things like that, then you probably want to optimize how you deploy your application. Maybe you want to scale, adding more nodes horizontally, so you have more processes running that. There's a whole section in the FastAPI documentation about deployment, explaining all the concepts necessary and to the abstract levels of processes and memory and how you can divide that and how you can work with that if you are deploying directly or if you are using containers or if you are using Kubernetes or whatever. So for you to be able to handle as much users as you want, just write your normal code and it should pretty much work fine. You shouldn't have to worry at the beginning with that. When you need to squeeze performance, then you will have to start using async and await. So the first thing is, when you are starting to see that you need to handle more concurrency, first, you are going to add more servers. That's much cheaper than your hours working, than your time working and like changing all the code. So that's just going to be cheaper to add more servers. Then afterwards, when you really need to squeeze performance, then you start checking what are the sections of the code that are like the hot paths, what are the sections of the code that are run the most and that are being slowest, and then you optimize those paths. And the way to optimize it is in many cases just like using async and await with async and await compatible libraries, but making sure that you are not running blocking code inside of async code. So if you need to do that, then you will use asyncer, which is this other library that I built for combining async code with the blocking code. And then after you do that, you might want to squeeze more performance. Like one of the things that you should do early on is just create the Pydantic models to validate the data, the input data, and also for the output data, because this is going to ensure that your data is like correct. But soon, Pydantic is going to do the validation and the serialization of the data. So parsing the data and serializing the data to JSON, and then Pydantic is going to be able to do that on the Rust side without even going through Python. So it's going to be much faster to have Pydantic models than to not have Pydantic models. The other thing is you definitely want to upgrade to Pydantic V2. That's probably like going to be like the first thing that you should do, because it's just so much faster and it's pretty much for free. You just, in most of the cases, you just upgrade the version and then you suddenly have much better performance. You should make sure that you're installing, if you're using Ubicorn, you're installing Ubicorn with the standard extras. So Ubicorn square brackets standard, because that will start UVLoop, which is the high performance drop-in replacement for async IO. You don't need to know the details, you don't need to do anything, but just like if you install Ubicorn standard, then you get like all the performance that you can get from Ubicorn. And then if you need to tweak more some of the code paths, then you can return a response directly and you can ensure that you serialize the data yourself. So for example, if you are not using Pydantic V2 and you want to serialize with OR.json, then you can just do that directly, skipping the logic from FastAPI that will serialize the data for you. But the thing is, the main point is you should not worry about any of this until you have paying customers. Before that, you know, it's probably not worth it. Or, well, I don't know, paying customers, or like actually you have thousands of users that you are seeing, that you really have thousands because you have thousands of requests in your Sentry, and Sentry is charging you more because you have so many users. In that case, then you can think like, okay, how do I optimize now?
Thank you. Do you know of any FastAPI projects in production which are working under those thousands of user loads?
Thousands of user loads. I don't know specifically like what is the load of many of the projects. I know that, for example, I know many cool projects that are using FastAPI. For example, you know, like the Space Telescope Institute of the United States that is handling the science data for the Webb Space Telescope and like distributing all that science data throughout the world is that is done with FastAPI, which is like a heavy load. I don't know how much in terms of amounts of users, but a lot in terms of amount of data. I know that, well, I know that ChatGPT is used quite a lot, and like that uses quite a bunch of FastAPI underneath. I know that, you know, Netflix, Uber, Microsoft APIs and Microsoft AI APIs use a lot of FastAPI. I know there are banks built on FastAPI, you know, car manufacturers, rocket ship manufacturers, people controlling single atoms for quantum computers, although that's probably not a lot of users. That's probably like a few users controlling that. Or for example, FastAPI used at the CERN to control the particle accelerators, like the Large Hadron Collider, that's controlled with FastAPI, which is like exciting and scary, but that's probably not a lot of concurrent users. But yeah, like there's a bunch of different applications and different types of applications that I'm not really sure which ones have like the biggest load across all of them. But yeah, it's a lot of interesting use cases. It's also a funny thing that developing FastAPI, I don't necessarily get that much insight into how people are actually using FastAPI in their applications, in their products. It's just, in many cases, it's just like, you know, like I'm in a conference and then someone comes and says like, hey, FastAPI is huge at Cisco. That's so cool. And I'm like, what? I had no idea. So yeah, in many cases, I just don't really know who else is using FastAPI, apart from a bunch of companies that I already know. But yeah.
So thank you. So you mentioned Rust briefly. So I might have a spicy question for you that was submitted. Besides Pydantic, are you using any Rust code in FastAPI? why not just write FastAPI in Rust?
So Rust is already the core, like the core of Pydantic is built in Rust, was rebuilt in Rust for Pydantic version 2. That's what gives it like all these like, you know, incredible extra performance that now is like 20x. It's not 2x, it's not 200%, it's like 2000%, it's 20x more performance, specifically to Pydantic. If you apply that to FastAPI, then like you will get like, I don't know, 2 or 3x or something, because you have all the network. And like, there's no way to optimize the network apart from like, you know, giving like fiber optics to every one of your users. So like the network is still gonna be the bottleneck always. In FastAPI, it probably wouldn't make that much sense to optimize a lot inside of FastAPI, maybe more even in Ubicorn and the server side that is like parsing and handling the requests. Maybe at some point it could make sense to optimize some bits of the internals of FastAPI. But the thing is that most of the pieces that actually end up like having like all the heavy load are the ones that really need like all the optimization, and that is, you know, on the Pydantic side and maybe on the server side. But yeah, at some point I want to do some profiling of FastAPI itself and like try to see like where else can I squeeze performance, because most of the FastAPI performance is mainly because it uses great tools underneath, like Pydantic and Ubicorn using the ASCII spec, and Ubicorn can use UV-loop. So, you know, like all this extra performance comes from all the building blocks inside of it. Maybe at some point it could make sense to also have like additional optimizations in FastAPI itself. But like, yeah, first, as we were saying before, making it work and then making it right and then making it fast. There's still a bunch of things that I want to add and that I want to improve in FastAPI before switching to, you know, just like tweaking the little knobs and seeing like how to improve performance more.
So we do have quite a good question in the chat from Jules, actually, about performance. You were talking about at the end of the day, it's all about the network connection and the number of nodes based on the speed to an extent. So how does FastAPI's framework fit into the serverless architecture with Lambdas and API gateway? And what advantages does it offer in terms of development, scalability, and performance in this context?
So there's a lot of teams that actually use FastAPI in serverless systems. In Lambdas, you will use a plugin called Mangum. In Azure, they actually have like a first-class support for FastAPI and for like ASCII applications. And the examples are with FastAPI. In Google, you will use Google Cloud Run, which is just like a single Docker container. So there are many teams that are using serverless systems. And like, yeah, of course, it will benefit you, because in most of these cases, these serverless systems or functions as a service, or however you call them, maintain like one of these processes that is executing. They keep it warm if there are more incoming requests. So if your system is being able to handle more requests per second using the same amount of resources, you know, your fee is going to be a little smaller than if you were like handling just like if your system and your application was super slow. Now, the performance and like the throughput and like the amount of users that you can handle is not going to be too affected, because all the serverless things were made just to be able to create more processes to handle more users as they come. So FastAPI is just going to be like, yeah, just going to probably make your application a tiny bit cheaper or something like that, but everything is still going to work. Now, in terms of development and scalability. So in terms of scalability, you are not tied to a particular provider, and you can deploy it however you want and wherever you want. You don't have to deploy it on serverless, which is what will happen if you were using like the specific serverless framework. And in terms of development, and in particular in terms of developer experience, you will have a much better developer experience if you are able to run your application, your API locally, having automatic API documentation, interacting from your browser to your running application, and then saving the code that you just changed, and then having that reload automatically with Ubicorn Reload, and just being able to send the request again and checking if the error was actually solved. Or even better, running through a debugger in your editor, going step by step, handling the request, instead of like the alternative of that when using serverless systems and providers is that you just write a bunch of code, put it in a zip file. It's not even Git, it's a zip file, as if it was going to an email, and then you upload it to a user interface and you click on deploy, and then you hope that it actually deployed. And then you have to check if it was actually deployed, the version that you wrote or not, or like what is happening, and then just debug through reading the logs. So, you know, like the process is much more artisanal with these new systems, which is kind of contradictory, but like, yeah, anyway. The thing is, by having a better developer experience and having a much faster iteration speed while writing your code and building your product, you're gonna be able to ship much faster and like build your product much faster. So I think that's probably the biggest advantage of using FastAPI or a tool like this. And the thing is, you can use FastAPI and deploy it on one of the serverless systems if you want. But like, yeah, I think that's probably the biggest benefit of using FastAPI in that context.
Thank you. Couple of ORM-based questions. The first one, is there a way to use Pydantic as the model for an ORM directly? Why or why not?
Yes, you will use SQL model, which is the tool that I built, that is built on top of SQL Alchemy and Pydantic. And all the work, all the SQL work is done by SQL Alchemy, all the data work is done by Pydantic. And you create a single class that is pretty much a Pydantic class. But then this class is at the same time both a Pydantic class and a SQL Alchemy class. It's just doing like all the black magic of Python inside just to make that work and make it work for SQL Alchemy and for Pydantic. So yes, you can use that. I built SQL model for that specific use case.
And you also mentioned SQL Alchemy and MongoDB. So do you have personal experience, or are you aware of someone's experience combining FastAPI and Google Spanner DB? Would you suggest finding an ORM in this case, or is raw SQL fine?
So for SQL Alchemy, this tool I built, SQL model, is built on top of SQL Alchemy. For MongoDB, I will recommend Authmantic. You can also try Beanie if you are more comfortable with the Django style of making queries. For Google Spanner DB, I actually haven't used it myself, and so I'm not really sure like what. I don't know if it's like a specific product or if it's a flavor of one of the SQL engines or a flavor of one of the document storage systems, or maybe it's a flavor of one of these column-oriented databases. I'm not really sure which one it is, but it will probably make sense. If there's no ORM provided by them, it will probably make sense to have one on top of Pydantic, or like just like build it on top of Pydantic directly.
Okay, thank you. So another Pydantic themed question. Do you have thoughts on how to use Pydantic when working with dynamic data? For instance, if you allow your users to create their own database columns, would dynamic Pydantic models work with OpenAPI, for example?
Oh, wait, let me repeat that, please. Just give me 1 second, because Andrew was saying Google SQL. So I get Google Spanner is Google SQL. So this is SQL. If it has a driver for SQL Alchemy, you can just like use SQL Alchemy directly. You can use SQL Alchemy FastAPI. And because SQL model is built on top of SQL Alchemy, then you can use it with SQL model also directly. I think this was the question from Andrew. I'm actually not sure. Sorry. Now let's continue with the other one.
Okay.
Yeah, can you repeat that, please?
Do you have thoughts on how to use Pydantic when working with dynamic data? For instance, if you allow your users to create their own database columns, would dynamic Pydantic models work with OpenAPI?
Yeah, so this is kind of weird, because if you allow your users to create dynamic data like with whatever shape they want, then you will not have like a clear way of how to ensure the schema is correct and how to ensure that the data is correct. In that case, you will end up defining like, oh, this is a dictionary that has strings as keys and like whatever type as values, and that's it. And in that case, like you don't get much benefit from Pydantic, and you will have a very hard time developing with that. You will normally want to have like some predefined document shapes that you will define with Pydantic. And for, you know, like free-form data that you want to allow your users to create, like you want the users to create their own, like, I don't know, tags or something like that, then you will have some section in each one of the documents that is just let for the users to put whatever they want, but like you will have to deal with that as if it was garbage in your own code. You cannot trust what the users put in there, because you are not validating that if you just allow them to put like free form data. Now you can create so like thinking about like having just like free form data. Now about specifically if you have some particular use case where you actually have the shape of the data, what it is, but it's just not in Pydantic models, but you can extract that from some other places. So for example, from, I don't know, JSON schema in some files or something like that. Then you can indeed create dynamic Pydantic models on the fly, and then you can use them in FastAPI, and then they are going to work in OpenAPI, and like in the validation, and everything is just going to work. It's just that if you have Pydantic models, then you don't get auto-completion, inline errors, and all the stuff in your code. So you don't get like the nice developer experience. But if you are not actually interacting directly with each one of those objects, but you just like are passing them through from the database to the API or something like that, then like that should just like work. You can just like use create the models dynamically. You can use there's this project called Code Generator. I think it's Code Generator, Data Model Generator, I think is the name. That just generates Pydantic models on the fly from JSON schema documents or things like that. But yeah, you can definitely do that.
That is a very scary concept, thinking about users doing that to your application. Thank you for your answer. Right, I want to move slightly into a different theme for the moment, and I want to go into the open source theme. And we've got a few questions about open source and FastAPI in that context. So more advice from you, please. What's your top piece of advice for starting an open source project and for contributing to open source in general?
So for starting an open source project, again, it's just like focusing on a problem. In many cases, it will be just like learning how to use a tool. Then when you learn how to use an open source tool, when you go and read the documentation for that tool, you will probably find a typo. You will probably find a mistake in the text or some. Almost always you find it. Whenever I'm trying to use a new tool, I almost immediately fork the repo and start like fixing the typos, because that is normally the first contribution that you can make, and it's actually super easy, and it's very valuable. It's very useful because the author or the maintainer writes the documentation, and then that person never reads that documentation again, because like, the creator already knows how to use the tool, doesn't need to go back to read the documentation every time. In some cases we need to, but not all the time. So it's very difficult to detect those little mistakes. But you, with fresh eyes, learning how to use a new tool, you will detect those mistakes so much easier. And then you can just contribute to that. That will be just like the first point of interaction of how to contribute to that. Then the next thing is like when you are focusing on solving a problem, if you see that there is no tool that is actually solving that problem, and it's something that you really need solved, and you need it solved the way that actually is useful to you, you might end up seeing that there's nothing else to do, and then you just have to try and solve it yourself. And then you can just create a project for that. Now, if it's a problem that is important to you, there's a chance that it's also important to other people. And if the solution that you create is actually being useful to you, there's a chance that it's going to be useful to other people. So then you can just like make it open source and just like help others being able to use it. Now, if you want to make sure that others are able to use it properly, then you probably spend some time in the documentation trying to explain it for someone, for a newcomer, how to use it and how to achieve things with that. And that will probably help others adopt your tool and like being able to solve that same specific problem with your tool. And that might like end up being useful and helpful and successful, sort of. So yeah, I think that will be it. But again, it's just like focusing on a problem.
Quick Sentry plug in the context of open source. Another way to get involved is to just tell us what's wrong with it, submit some issues, tell us the problems you're having so that we can fix them. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be contributions to the code. You can contribute by telling us the bugs you find. So plenty of ways without much effort to get involved with open source.
And actually, if you want to contribute to FastAPI, there's a whole section of how to help FastAPI. And one of the biggest helps that I receive, one of the biggest ways of help that I receive is just answering questions from others in GitHub discussions. There's just a lot of people that come asking questions, and I just can't answer to them all because there are just so many. but it's like one of the things that consumes time the most. And it's something that really helps a lot, helps me, helps the community, and helps others. Just like answering questions from others. That's actually what makes the FastAPI experts. There's an official section in the documentation that is the FastAPI experts, in the FastAPI people, and the FastAPI experts are the ones that are helping others with their questions. So, you know, you can become that just by going and helping others with their own questions.
So how does working on an open source project look like financially? And how do you make it sustainable until it becomes popular? How did that go for you?
The question should not be how do you make it sustainable until it goes popular. How to make it sustainable, that's it. You know, even after going popular, there's no certainty that it's going to be sustainable. It's very fun that it looks like most of the projects, like almost all the open source projects, look like they probably have like some huge enterprise behind the scenes, like, you know, like funding this, and like this probably is just like, you know, like there's a lot of companies paying for this to keep awake, to keep working, and that's generally not the case. Most of the open source projects tend to be underfunded, including Python itself, the language itself. You know, like there are some companies, there are some huge companies giving grants and stuff to make Python faster, to have people working on Python, and still it's actually like very little to what it could be. There's one single developer in residence. There's one single person that is dedicated just to working for Python from the Python Software Foundation. Well, now there's actually, I think now there are 2 or 3 recently, but you know, like 3 people for something like Python that is used by everyone, it's not that much. There's a lot of contributions from different companies, people that work at Red Hat, at Microsoft, at other places. And in some of these companies, they have like 1 or 2 people that are just like fully dedicated to Python, but that is pretty much the exception. I mean, most of the cases, it's just like people contributing in their free time, or maybe the company lets them contribute 1 day a week, but you know, it's actually very little. So making one of these projects sustainable is not easy at all. There's no silver bullet that will work for everyone. Each one of the projects that I have seen, each one of the maintainers that I have talked to, have their own way of trying to make it work. In many cases, it's just like a lot of sacrifice and a lot of free time. In my particular case, I am super lucky that I am in the Sequoia Open Source Fellowship. So Sequoia, the VC capital firm, they created this open source fellowship. So I get to cover like my expenses and stuff, and I can just like focus fully on open source for this year. So, you know, that's great, but it's like pretty much not the rule. It's very much the exception to the rule. But yeah, like I think what we can do to try to solve that is also to encourage companies to try to sponsor the tools that they depend on, because it's so much cheaper to make sure that the tool that you are using and that you are building a multi-billion-dollar product on, making sure that the tool that supports that is still alive, than suddenly realizing that, oh, it was abandoned and now it has like security issues or something, and then you just like have to rebuild everything from scratch. So it's actually like, you know, like it's not just altruism. It will be useful for companies to make sure that they support the projects that they use, but it's definitely not a solved problem.
Quick plug about Sentry's latest blog post about how much Sentry gives to open source. Actually, if we could get that in the chat, that would be really useful and great, because you're right. You know, if these companies are using open source tooling every day, it's great to be able to give back either with contributions or financial support. It's how the ecosystem will continue to thrive.
And Sentry is actually one of the few companies that has like a established open source funding program. There are not really many companies, and you will expect that the biggest companies will have something like that, but it's not really that much. So yeah, it's like ironies of life, I guess. But like, if there were more companies doing that, it will be so much better, you know, like the landscape of open source, and it will be so much doable, and it will make so much more sense.
The open source team at Sentry is trying. Yeah, so regarding your sponsorship from Sequoia, do you decide what to do, or do they tell you what to do? Do you have objectives? Do you have objectives set? How does that work?
You know, like I'm just fully left on my own to build what I think is just the best. I don't really have like to report or to anything. It's actually been great for me. Like I've been just being able to work on whatever I feel has like the biggest impact. So for example, there was, like the migration to Pydantic V2 was a lot of work. I got a lot of support from the Pydantic team, and they actually they spent weeks building features just for me, just for FastAPI, so that I will be able to integrate and all that stuff. But still, it was a lot of work. So it was, months of work just making that go. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I was not able to focus full time on just like working on this. But for example, recently I built the FastAPI reference documentation. So now there's a reference documentation that's quite recent. And that involved a lot of work underneath because I also wanted to improve the way that we can document APIs in Python. So it's using something different than, like plain doc strings, because I wanted to have something that would be more structured. But that involved a lot of work, including writing one of these standards for Python. And like, it's just a lot of work underneath that is not really visible, and is not easy to make that happen if you have to be like, reaching some specific deadlines or reaching some specific features or something in a very tight timeline. But then being able to do that, because I knew that this will have a big impact, that resulted in being able to have the new FastAPI documentation reference that like documents the whole internal API and all the stuff. So I think it's been great. I have been able just to work on all the things that I think have the biggest impact, and then like connect them together and just like keep going on that. So yeah, very much freedom.
This is a question from me now, actually. How do you assess the impact of the things that you're building? And you say, oh, I just get to build whatever I think is great. Like, how do you assess that and then reflect on that and then change your course or keep going? Like, that sounds quite interesting.
One of the things, so of course, like there's a lot of feedback from the users and people like wanting to use one thing or the other. So for example, there's a lot of users using SQL model. There's a lot of companies, organizations, government institutions and things using SQL model. So I know that SQL model is important and that I have to pay attention to that. At the same time, there's a lot of other ideas that I just have been having for a long while and that I have been wanting to implement. In many cases, I see people asking questions or reporting something that doesn't work for them, or people suggesting to improve things in one or another way. But then I know that if I do this particular thing here, I'm going to be able to solve multiple of these things at the same time, and it's going to have a much better developer experience. It's going to be a lot easier to use. So then I just like, in many cases, I just focus on some of these things, even if it's not very obvious that it will make sense and that it will that this will replace several approaches and will solve several of the existing problems that some people can have in their applications. And in many cases, I just like, put more emphasis on that and more work on that. And like, yeah, like I guess there's also a lot of intuition, I guess. There's also a lot of that I have ended up having to learn how these type annotations work and how the internal parts of these things work just while building it. So it's also like a bit of extra context that I can use and apply when solving one of these problems. And at the same time, it's just like, like also the feeling and the intuition of how will it feel better to work with this, and how could I simplify the code, and how could I make it more intuitive and more enjoyable to work with. That's what I have been since the beginning, since I started with FastAPI. So it's also like just kind of applying the same idea and the same process over and over again, and just like keep it improving. So yeah.
Thank you for answering my question. So you mentioned documentation and all the things you're doing around documentation, and we have a question about documentation. How do you approach your documentation and continue the approach of documentation-driven development with LLMs in mind? How is your process for great docs, both for humans and AI to parse?
So, well, for AI to parse documentation is actually just like, it's pretty much like, having good SEO. You just need to be able for it to be readable by a standard scrapper. It's not that you need to do something particularly fancy for LLMs to be able to parse it, because they just like take, like pure text tokenize that, and then convert that to numbers, to vectors, to matrices, and then feed those matrices to these large language models. But it's not that you have to write the content in some particular way or something like that. Not really. Now, LLMs can help a lot when writing documentation, because, for example, I use GitHub Copilot, and then it can autocomplete some sentences and some things like that, and it can be very, very useful in some cases. Not necessarily for everything. So for most of the things, I just like write the documentation myself, but it can complete some sentences and things like that. It's not that I can tell it like, oh, write the documentation for all this section and then just like leave it whatever is output. Not really. But you know, some sections, some fragments, or for example, for tests, it can help a lot. The thing is, LLMs, ChatGPT, all these tools, they are useful whenever you can see the output, whatever it is that it's telling you, and you can quickly verify just by reading, you can verify that it's correct or not. So if you are telling it, hey, tell me what is the healthiest food, and it just tells you, oh, you should eat carrots, you don't have a way to verify that. You don't have a way to know if it's correct or not. And you can tell it, hey, tell me why. And it can say, like, I don't know, it has so many proteins, blah, 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 or something, but you don't have a way to verify that information. So you cannot simply use it. You cannot trust it. If you tell it, hey, I want to create a Python dictionary made of this list, and then you see the output code that is very simple, but you can quickly see if it's correct or not, then you can use that. If you can very easily and very quickly check if the output is correct, then you can use it. Otherwise, it's just not trustable. So yeah, for example, if you tell it, hey, I want to write this very complex function for me, it's just going to spit a lot of code that will look super fancy. But if you cannot know if it's correct or not, you're going to spend less time writing it by hand yourself than trying to verify if that correct is, if that code is correct or not. So yeah, it can just help for the cases that you can quickly verify that the result is correct.
I like the fact that you say, hey, every time you want to ask ChatGPT a question.
And you have to say thanks at the end,
yeah,
just in case.
Just in case, because you don't know who's watching. Talking about who's watching, we have 10 minutes left. Time has really flown. So I'm going to probably give you some quick fire questions now. There are some from the Zoom chat and some left on my list. But SQL model, very important. You've been talking a lot about how you need to pay attention to it. So a few SQL model questions. How does SQL model work well with a Lembic migration for database versioning?
You can just use it. You can kind of plug and play the documentation and the things that you use for SQL Alchemy, and you can just use that in SQL model. Still, I'm gonna add like additional like convenience ideas, tools, and like a CLI for SQL model, so you can do things a bit easier, but you can already use that.
And does SQL model support PG vector? If not, will it?
I actually don't know if you can actually make it work already. I haven't tried it myself, but it makes a lot of sense to support it because, like, you know, it's going to be used by like all the machine learning stuff that want to use vectors in Postgres. So definitely it will probably support it at some point. I will probably want to have support for that at some point.
Okay, some more quickfire questions. Do you know of any other cool admin UI tools similar to Django admin that can be used with FastAPI and Pydantic?
Yes, so with FastAPI, normally Django admin or tools like this depend more on the database layer than on the framework layer. So if you are using SQL Alchemy or SQL Model, you can probably use SQL admin. Is a very similar tool to Django admin and is connected to SQL Model or to SQL Alchemy through FastAPI. So you have pretty much the same thing.
Thank you. And this one's hopefully not too long-winded, completely different subject to what we've been talking about. Well, what's the recommended way in FastAPI to implement pagination?
Pagination depends a lot on your specific API, on your specific database, and how you want to handle it. One option is to have like an abstract, like a cursor that then you send to that is just like an opaque string, and then you send it to the user, and then they send it back, and then you use that to continue paginating. That's how, for example, GitHub works, or Facebook, or many GraphQL APIs work. The other option that I think is probably simpler and is what I will normally use is to have like a field for limit and another for skip to say how much data you want to receive. But that's actually not even specifically pagination, because pagination is talking about like having pages and then like going through numbers of pages, but you're actually going through records. So it's very specific to your own application. What I will do will be having 2 query parameters, one skip and one limit, skip or offset, however you want to call it. And then I will pass those parameters to the database to filter the data directly.
Thank you. I hope that was helpful for whoever answered that question. Maybe a couple of spicy questions now on the quickfire round. So this comes from someone who is continuously traumatized by their company's use of Java and Spring Spaghetti. Why does FastAPI have dependency injection?
So I wanted to have some of the ideas that I learned from the front-end world that uses a lot more of these concepts of dependency injection, but I wanted to remove all the complexity and the spaghettiness of that. So I'm not sure I can call it dependency injection, because there's a lot of the terms that you will use in all these other frameworks, like containers and services and providers and a bunch of those things that I don't have. In FastAPI, a dependency is just a function, and you give it to FastAPI and you say, hey, FastAPI, call this for me. And that's it. It's just that. It's just that it calls the thing and it injects the value in your function for you. But it's like a, like a super, super simple version of a dependency injection system. It's useful in FastAPI for some specific use cases. You can see more in the documentation. I won't like spill everything here.
Thank you. Talking of the front end, what about building a JavaScript front end for FastAPI?
So normally the front end is very specific to the application that you are building. But in most of the cases, you will want to have a nice developer experience when building the front end. In those cases, you probably want, in those cases, and in most of the cases, you probably want to use automatically generated client code. And there's a section in the FastAPI documentation, in the advanced tutorial, the advanced guide is like one of the last chapters. It's about generating clients automatically and has like all the instructions for generating front-end clients so that you can have all the auto-completion and inline errors from your backend in your TypeScript code in the front end. That's what I think will be the most important thing. I also have a project generator that I haven't been able to work on in a long while, and that's like one of the main things that I'm gonna work on next, because I'm gonna add like Pydantic version 2 is like a cookie cutter, as someone asked. And I'm gonna add Pydantic version 2, SQL model, and a new front end, and like a bunch of and someone's gonna help me also with the new front end and a bunch of the things that you will want to have in like a bare bones application, just like starting a template application.
Thank you. Now, talking of, I mean, I was trying to do a good segue, and maybe there's not a good segue to this question, but this is a very good question. I'm going to probably ask this question and one more to finish, because we are coming up to 4 minutes left. So this one was submitted by Aways. In the context of debugging, are there any specific debugging tools, techniques, or practices that can help developers identify and resolve issues in FastAPI applications, particularly when dealing with complex interactions?
Yes, I will definitely use a powerful editor like Visual Studio Code or PyCharm. Both of those have very nice and very simple debugging tools. Debugging and like using a debugger normally sounds like, oh, this is super sophisticated and like engineering or something, but it's actually just like configuring JSON with a couple of lines telling it how to call Ubicorn, and then just like putting red dots in your editor, and it will just stop there. I think that's one of the best developer experiences that you can have, like one of the best ways to be like as efficient as possible, in particular when debugging complex stuff. So I personally use the Visual Studio Code debugger directly.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of people can get too bogged down with debugging tools sometimes. And I mean, I'm a JavaScript developer, so nothing beats just like console log or looking in the browser like debugger. It's, you know,
oh
just
yeah,
keep
you
it
can
simple.
have like a print everywhere.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. It just, I mean, why not, right? It's why not? Right. Final question. And someone asked, Sebastian, when can we expect to have a book written by you?
You probably shouldn't expect a book written by me. I have actually rejected many requests from all the editorials you probably will know to write a book. But the thing is, I prefer to invest that time in improving the documentation. The documentation is written as a book or as a tutorial or as a course, and you probably wouldn't need much more than the documentation itself. I spent so much time in the documentation of these tools that you should be able just to learn everything just by reading the documentation. I also have a lot more features, and it's so much more powerful for me to write in the documentation with all the, all the features of the web than in a book, in paper. So for me, it just works better to write like that. And also it's free for everyone. So you can probably just like go to the documentation and read the documentation from head to bottom, and you're gonna learn everything I have to explain. The same applies for all my tools. In FastAPI, I explain not just how to use FastAPI, but how to build APIs, and also some tricks and some tips of how to work with Python. For Typer, I explain how to build command line applications and how it works, and like where does it apply, and like, all the stuff. For SQL model, I spend a long time explaining how databases work and how you can use with SQL directly before even touching any Python code. So I try to explain everything that I can as the best way that I can, as I wished I was learning when I was just like studying those things. So that's probably going to be the closest that we will get to a book by me. But yeah, it's still the same content.
Books go out of date as soon as they're printed, don't they? And, documentation online can be changed and will evolve forever, especially from contributions from the community using FastAPI. That was a good segue to the beginning, wasn't it? Right. We are at time. Please show your appreciation for Sebastian in the chat for joining us for this hour that has flown by. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And where can people find you on the internet? What are you doing next?
You can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I normally post the stuff that I do in those channels. I'm working on FastAPI. I'm working on SQL model, Typer. The full stack project generator is going to have a lot of work soon. I'm also gonna give like a couple of keynotes in PyCon in Europe. So yeah, maybe see you around there.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great day, and I will see you at the next one. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.